Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, folks, to our second in our Race and Social Justice in the Arts Speakers Series. I'm Joe Arredondo. I'm Director of Landmark Arts, and we're excited that we can still do this, even if it's all via Zoom, I think Zoom gives us the opportunity to have twice as many speakers as we would normally have, so it's a good thing. For today, there's a Q&A feature down at the bottom of your screen. As you think of questions, write them in there. We don't accept questions through the chat feature. We like to have them recorded in the Q&A feature. And then at the end of the talk, Aaron will field the questions with Zora and will answer as many of them as we can within the allotted time. This series is funded by a generous grant from the Helen Jones Foundation, who's been supporting Landmark Arts for many, many years. And then in addition to that, we use student cultural activities fees to help support the program. And so at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Aaron Hagert, one of our professors in photography, who will introduce our guest and then moderate the session. And I'm going to go video dark and audio dark so I don't interfere with the presentation. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for that, Joe. And thanks everybody for being here. I'm just going to introduce Zora briefly and then let him do his thing. Zora J. Murff is an assistant professor of art at the University of Arkansas. He received his MFA from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and holds a BS in psychology from Iowa State University. Merging his educational experiences, Murff uses his practice to highlight intersections between various social systems and art. He has exhibited his work widely, including recent inclusion in New Photography at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, Prison Nation, curated by the Aperture Foundation at the University of Maryland, and The Neighbors at University of South Florida, among many others. This year, he was included in the Silver Eye Center's inaugural Silver List, and his most recent monograph, At No Point in Between, was selected as the winner of the independently published category of the Lucy Foundation Photo Book Awards. Please join me in welcoming Zora J. Murff. Thanks, Zora. Take it away.
Yeah. Thank you so much for inviting me and for such a warm introduction. Yeah, so today I'm just going to share a bit about myself and my practice, and just give, I guess, kind of a chronology of sorts. And so I'd like to start this lecture with this quote by Michelle Alexander, who is the author of The New Jim Crow, which talks about mass incarceration in America and its roots in slavery. But anyway, last summer she published an op-ed in the New York Times, and I pulled this quote from it just because it was something that resonated pretty strongly with me at the time. It says, "It's not enough to learn the broad outlines of this history. Only by pausing long enough to study the cycles of oppression and resistance does it become clear that simply being a good person or not wishing Black people any harm is not sufficient." And the reason I start with this quote is because, I think that she's, in a way, trying to call us to attention, to pay attention, to dig deeply into the history of racism in America. And that, like today I'm going to touch on a lot of broad outlines, but maybe sort of illustrate how I, arrived at broad outlines and then, found ways of digging more deeply to learn about, how racism functions in this country. And so I made this work last year, this image last year, and It's titled 31 degrees, 7 minutes, 25.94 seconds north, 81 degrees, 33 minutes, and 22.45 seconds west. And so I made this after I read the news about Ahmaud Arbery being murdered in Satilla Shores, Georgia. And I was, at the time that I made this photograph, I wasn't really intending, or well, maybe I shouldn't say that. Like when I made this photograph, like I was, just outside, in a park, just on a walk with my wife, and I was just thinking about Ahmaud Arbery as I was standing by this field of flowers, and I made this photograph. And I've been thinking a lot recently about abstraction, and how when these moments happen, like how do we find ways of speaking about them? And I've begun recently to rely on abstraction, maybe as a way of getting people, thinking back to that Michelle Alexander quote, to pay attention. And so, this image wasn't like the title is the coordinates for where Ahmaud was murdered. But there's like, of course, that physical separation, that this isn't that landscape. But through manipulating the camera and making the shutter drag, and you catch motion as I'm moving the camera, as I'm taking the photograph, it becomes this idea of what one might sort of see as they're running, or maybe, like how when we see these cell phone videos of these happenings, it sort of exists in that same kind of visual language. But that it takes time and attention. And so I hope that's something that all of you can sort of bring to this talk today, and hopefully carry forward in your day-to-day lives. And I'll also just use this as a moment to acknowledge that there are descriptions and images of violence in this lecture. And yeah, just to put that out from the beginning. So I didn't know that I would one day be an artist and a professor. Like as a kid, I had a lot of different dreams of like for myself of what my life might look like. When I graduated from high school, I dove headlong into going to college because everybody around me was telling me if I didn't go that I, probably wouldn't go back to school. And yeah, I had no true idea of like what it was I wanted to do. And so I ended up studying psychology. But then after graduating, quickly realizing I didn't plan to go to like grad school to, become like a professor in psychology, or, like a counselor or anything like that. And so I, just started working in the human services field. I worked with kids and adults with disabilities, worked with folks with mental illnesses. And that led me to working at a juvenile detention facility in Eastern Iowa. And it was at that point in my life that I decided I was going to start taking photographs and go back to school and study art. And so, like these 3 years, 2012 to 2015, was like this time where I was merging those two parts of my life together, being an artist and being a social worker. And so I started studying photography at the University of Iowa. And I was taking, like the advanced courses, and the goal of those courses were to just spend the semester making a body of work. So, you know, I was working full time. I was a full-time student, and that didn't leave a lot of space to contemplate, you know, some idea of something to photograph. And so I was like, well, I'll just photograph what I do. And so I started this project, Corrections, which, you know, I guess uses photography as a way of gaining insight into the system that's, you know, made anonymous, the juvenile criminal justice system. But also thinking about how photography is implicated inside of the system, given its history, you know, the mugshot, the role the mugshot plays in building a criminal type, you know, how we see, like when we see images of people labeled criminals, like that comes with a lot of baggage and stigma along with it. And so that, you know, photography is sort of present in the system, but maybe in ways that we don't think about very actively. And so I just, you know, I asked my boss if this was an okay thing to do. And she was like, yeah, you just have to make the kids anonymous. And so this, you know, this portrait of Kenny, his name isn't Kenny, it's a pseudonym. And, you know, this photograph, like this portrait, this is one of the first portraits that I made. And I like to think of it as my birth as an artist, in the sense that it was a moment where I was aware of, you know, like my own sort of artistic insights, my intentions, expression of those things, and, you know, a little bit of luck sprinkled in there, like all of those things meeting. But again, important, like more importantly, that I was like aware, I was cognizant of, you know, this was a moment where like art could be made. And you know, I was fumbling around with my camera, and you know, just trying to figure out like what I was going to do to hide his face. And he reached up to scratch the back of his neck, and it was, you know, really striking and beautiful. And so I just asked him to hold that. And so this became sort of the standard. Every portrait that I made after this, it had to be as good, if not better. And so, you know, beginning to make this work, I had to think a lot about my role as a photographer and also as a service provider. So the job, like specifically that I had, I was what's called a tracker. And so my office was at this detention facility, but I was a community service, like in a community service role. So I was working with kids who were on probation, and it was my job to, you know, like my primary role was to be an intervention in situations that could result in them having additional contact with law enforcement. But that, like, I also did other things, like, you know, I helped them search for jobs. I, you know, like if they had community service hours, I would help them find, you know, different ways of doing community service. You know, I would check up on their progress in school if that was something that was called for. So it was a pretty dynamic role. But I could never escape that I was like a physical manifestation of a form of punishment, right? And so I had to navigate that while I was making images of them and thinking about their experiences through the system. And so, you know, I like really forefronted like making the portraits, and then just through over time and like through critiques and things, you know, people like wanting to know like more, you know, like wanting to see different aspects of the system. And so I started to try to find different ways of showing that. And one of those ways was digging back through like these archives of documents that are collected when kids are incarcerated. So, you know, if a kid is in lockup, they have to do like all these assignments and assessments. All of those things get filed away, and they're not really ever touched again. And so I started looking through those things, and then just started scanning those documents, making them into images. But trying to, like, I guess I always had to struggle with this balance between, like, sort of being, categorized as like a documentary photographer, or maybe a photojournalist. Not that those are like bad things, but that to me, I was just always just trying to be an artist. And so to me, like, I didn't want to have to adhere to like these sort of principles or ethics, or be hyper concerned with objectivity. By making this, I'm talking about, somebody else's experience, but one that I can't talk about fully because I'm an outsider to it. And so I am only talking about like what I see, and like sort of conclusions I'm drawing from those things that I'm seeing. And this is where like research became really important. Like an important aspect of my artistic practice, because I had to be able to like talk more fully about those things that I was seeing. And so I was fortunate enough that in Eastern Iowa, there were a bunch of publicly funded initiatives to study criminal justice trend, juvenile criminal justice trends in the area. And so they would publish these annual reports, and then there would be like a big conference held, and people would, like leaders in the community and all this stuff would like, try to figure out like, how do we solve these problems that we're seeing in our community? And so, like, but just thinking about like, a part of those reports were, talking about the use of disorderly conduct charges inside of schools as a way, like police using disorderly conduct charges inside of schools as a mode of discipline, but then also as a pipeline into the system, with the understanding that once a kid has contact with the criminal justice system, the likelihood of them having additional contact throughout their life increases tremendously. And so, I'm reading these, and I'm like, it's like telling me like there's this many disorderly conduct arrests in schools, this year. And then I'm making a portrait of a kid, and then I'm like, I know that that's a kid who's been in that particular situation. And so I'm seeing these statistics play out in real time, through my direct experience inside of the system, working inside of the system. And so waking up to like, I guess like waking up to that fact helped me better understand how to articulate these things when I'm like, both in creative expression and in just, in language. But also waking me up to how the nature of how white supremacy pervades institutions. So this is a work by Anna Martine Whitehead. It's titled Ferguson Morning. And it's a surveillance image of from the murder of Michael Brown by Ferguson police officer Darren Wilson in 2014. And so just off camera, at the bottom right, Michael Brown's body is laying out on full display on Canfield Drive. And the police left him out there for 4 hours for the community to witness until somebody broke the barrier and covered up his body. But the reason I like to talk about this image is because of the way, she talks about how like sort of aligning it with the genre, like with the genre of like pastoral paintings, which are like everyday like paintings of everyday scenes, often landscapes. And but just doing that through cropping, the act of cropping, and a title, right? And then, calling it art, sort of injecting it into this realm where we have to look at this image that's a very tragic image. But because she's cropped it, and maybe if we're not very familiar with this image, we're just sort of looking at formal things and thinking about, like we're thinking about things aesthetically. And then the title itself, again, sort of mirroring pastoral paintings that often have these, kind of bland, basic titles. But then if we think about if we connect what this image is with this idea of an everyday scene, like that's where the power is, right? That this is an everyday thing that I, as a Black person, have to think about, that many Black people think about on a daily basis, that we have to contend with. And so, I like this work because of how powerful it is in its simplicity. And I think that's something that I often try to do in my own work. But back in the context of me being a tracker in 2014, shortly after this meeting made the news, I was called into a meeting, with my supervisors and colleagues to help us prepare to navigate discussions with kids about Michael Brown's death. Because again, our primary job is to be an intervention between kids and police. During that meeting, one of my supervisors made a hands up, don't shoot joke. And so for those of you who may not be familiar, that was sort of the protest chant, like one of the big protest chants during this time. And nobody said anything. Some people kind of laughed, some people just kind of looked away or looked at the ground, and I was just looking around the room and nobody saying anything. And so I understood in that moment that I was only going to work in that job as long as I needed to. And that sort of set me on my next steps to going to grad school, which would eventually lead to me becoming a professor. And so I also like to think of this moment as like my second birth as an artist. The moment where I understood what my true intentions were with the work that I make. And so that led me to going to grad school. So, I applied to go to grad school at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, which is in Lincoln, Nebraska. And I was there from 2015 to 2018. And so the entire time I was working on this body of work, which I've published as a book a couple years ago, at no point in between. But before we talk about the work itself, there's a lot that sort of went into it. And mainly, so the work, talks about different modes of violence perpetrated on Black people by white people, again, throughout the history of this country. And, in this work, I think it's important to acknowledge that I'm talking about stories and experiences that aren't mine, in a sense that I didn't, live them directly or aren't connected to them directly. But it's a violence that I know and understand because it has happened in my life. When I was 14, my mom's boyfriend was murdered by our neighbors. There was an argument. One of the neighbors got into my mom's face and called her a nigger bitch. And her boyfriend, Robert, stepped in to defend her. Fight broke out, and the neighbor's friend stabbed Robert in the chest, and he died in our front yard. And so I know and understand the swiftness with the swiftness with which racial violence happens. And that in this work, I'm talking about that again in a lot of different ways, this being one of them. So the work looks at a particular neighborhood, North Omaha, which is in the city of Omaha, Nebraska. And so when I first started wanting to make work there, I had to, like, I started like just trying to get to know, like, yeah, like, what is this place about? And this is one of the first stories that I was told about Omaha, was the lynching of Will Brown in 1919. So Will Brown was the Black man. He was accused of raping a white woman. He had been arrested and was in jail. Story about this woman's rape spread, and so this mob amassed downtown Omaha at the Douglas County Courthouse and demanded Brown's release. The mayor showed up to try to calm the mob. They captured the mayor and said that they were going to lynch him in Will Brown's stead if Brown wasn't released. The sheriffs at that point decided to release Will Brown to them. They hung him from a light pole, shot bullets into his body, tied him to the bumper of a car, dragged him through the streets, and then eventually set him on fire. And then this photograph was made. The next history I was introduced to was the murder of Vivian Strong by an Omaha police officer named James Loader in 1969. Vivian was with some other kids in a vacant apartment, just doing kid stuff, like listening to music, having a little party. Someone called the police and all the kids ran out. And as Vivian Strong was running away, this officer shot her in the back of the head. He was acquitted of any charges. And after that, there were large-scale riots in the neighborhood of North Omaha. I'm learning about these histories. And then at the same time, this happened. Well, not the shooting of Laquan McDonald, the murder of Laquan McDonald rather, but the releasing of the video of his murder. After there was a citizen account that the police's original statement didn't match what actually happened. And so, I started learning about Will Brown. I started learning about Vivian Strong and decided at that point that, and then, saw this video when it was released. And I decided that I was going to follow Laquan's story from, this point until the very end. And then it also just became a way of understanding how anti-Black violence in America has truly become ingrained, from the original moment of slavery. And so I decided that it was important to tell these stories by looking at the landscape. And so that's where I decided to start. I just started visiting and walking around and looking and trying to figure out what it was that I was seeing. And I feel in a way, like as the neighborhood has started to change, I feel like in a way I was building an archive of the neighborhood at that particular time. But I don't know, I guess like more personally, I feel like I was making, like, this work kind of serves as an archive, like an interpersonal archive of me, between these years of 2015 and 2018. And an archive that reinterprets these really complex narratives about race and power and violence in America, and how those are perpetrated. And I think that I became so interested in this place because it was the first time, since I had been living in Nebraska, that I was in an environment where everybody else around me was Black, and where my existence was affirmed without question, where I wasn't ever approached with an air of suspicion when I was out with my camera. A space where I felt safer than I normally felt anytime, when I was living in Nebraska. And so, I was struggling with sort of figuring out where to begin in making the work. And so, the first year I was making it was really difficult because I was making a lot of photographs, but I just couldn't really talk about them. And so I started to really dig more deeply into these histories that people were just sort of kind of giving me the general kind of story. And so I actually started digging through the state archive because it was, a part of the university campus, and I had access to it as a student. And the more deeply that I dug into it, the more I started to really understand the complications of how we understand race in America. Even something as simple as the term race riot between 1919 and 1969, that somewhere in between, sort of the cultural understanding of race riot flipped. So in 1919, it was understood as a white mob going into a community of color and committing acts of violence. But somewhere in between 1919 and 1969, the term race riot in 69 meant a community of color exercising their frustrations on their immediate surroundings, because it's the last thing that we have left to do. And so I started to I guess as I started to think more deeply, then I could make more critical connections to the landscape. So in North Omaha, I was seeing vacant lots, things that look like they, or like dilapidated buildings, having an understanding that things once existed here that no longer do. And knowing that that was a direct effect of the 1969 riots. But maybe there was even more behind that. And I think that was, again, my primary struggle, with making this work, because I could make an image like this, I could present it in a critique, but then I would have to basically spend the entire critique educating people on the social phenomena that led to these moments. But it also, again, kind of brought me back into that research space, and knowing that I need to be educated about these things, not for the sake of other people, but just for myself, to know exactly what it is I'm talking about. And that led me to the process of redlining, which is a government endorsed form of segregation that was implemented through the evaluation of, or the valuation of land. So assigning land value. And so redlining, it didn't outrightly refuse, it's not an outright refusal of services, but rather, land is given a specific amount of value based on where it is, what it's located by, and the, racial makeup of, neighborhoods. And so, if you had a community of color, the government would give it a D rating, and basically, again, not refusing service, but pushing people away from investing in those areas. deeming those like investments in, you know, a place like North Omaha, the area in the middle of the map with the D in it, you know, basically saying, well, you don't really want to invest your money there because it's risky. You know, you might lose money if you invest there. And so going back to, you know, those vacant lots and dilapidated buildings, so knowing that the property destruction was caused from the riots, but then the community wasn't able to rebuild because of this process of redlining, this financial disinvestment. And so, you know, thankfully, like at the time, there was all of this really great research that was being published around the phenomenon of redlining. You know, so all of these maps were like hyper accessible. But then I knew that again, there had to be information past this just visual thing. And so I started looking for that, and I found the Underwriting Manual. So this was published by the Federal Housing Administration, the United States government. And this is a little snippet that, you know, basically dictated how land value could be determined. And one of those ways was by race. It says, if a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. A change in social or racial occupancy generally leads to instability and a reduction of values. So it's just a way of saying, you know, if a neighborhood is Black, you know, it should stay Black, right? You don't want people moving out. And that if you have a white neighborhood that starts to integrate, or, you know, people of color start moving in, that's going to lead to instability and to a reduction in values, in housing value. So a way of being able to segregate through policy in a really surreptitious way. And so, you know, I sort of got to the bottom, and then I started to work my way back out to be able to continue making my own work. And so this is documentation of the Burwood Wall in Detroit, Michigan, also known as the 8 Mile Wall. To the right is a Black neighborhood. To the left is undeveloped land that would become a white neighborhood. But before that wall existed, the developers who wanted to build the white neighborhood were like, hey, we want to build this white neighborhood, we need some money. And government was like, well, sure, we'll give you money, but we're not going to give you money unless there's a clear divide between Black and white. Because if there's no divide, your neighborhood's going to integrate, and then we're going to lose out on money. And so the developers built a wall. They built an 8 Mile wall to clearly delineate, separate Black and white. And also looking for, you know, artists who may be talking about similar things. So this is work by Latoya Fraser from her work, The Notion of Family. Yeah, so like in this work, you know, she's talking about post-industrialization in her hometown, Braddock, Pennsylvania. So looking at effects on the landscape and also on the people, but more directly her family. And so I was, you know, I bought the book and I was looking at the work, and I was reading the essay. It's in the back. And there's a citation to an article written by a sociologist named Rob Nixon. And in it, he says that, you know, like he used this term slow violence, and I was really fascinated by that term. And he basically says that, you know, we perceive violence in two different ways, fast and slow. And so we perceive, like the violence we all know and understand is typically fast violence. It's the violence where there's harm being done to like your physical self. But that there's other types of violence things like redlining, a form of slow violence that we don't understand in the same way because there is a really big gap between cause and effect. And so like that was like kind of the key for me. It was the understanding that I was trying to talk about violence in these particular ways, these particular instances. But that I was having trouble naming what I was seeing in the landscape as a mode of violence. And so it was like at that moment, everything sort of got brought together for me. And I was, yeah, like sort of, you know, found what I was looking for. And I could then sort of begin finding the visual language of the thing that I was trying to talk about in the landscape. And so, you know, studying, you know, the architecture, the topography, and infrastructure. And so when I was, you know, making this, I was living in Lincoln, which is 45 minutes from Omaha, and I was actually traveling on a piece of infrastructure that's common in the narrative of redlining, which are freeways. And so groundbreaking for the North Freeway happened in the 1960s, and it was built through North Omaha. First, well, I guess stepping back a little bit, it was originally supposed to be built through a white neighborhood, and all the white people got together and said, no, you're going to put it through the black neighborhood. And so it was like, you know, built to accommodate population growth, but then it had a drastic effect, counter effect on the black population of the city, where there was a 30% housing loss. And the community like began to sort of fracture because people started to leave because of it. And so, you know, I had a sort of desire to dismantle that structure. And, you know, so I just set out to do that photographically. But then I also began to wonder, you know, what other imagery of, you know, this freeway could I find that existed in the archives. And what I was really after particularly was an aerial view. And so as I was pouring through, like I actually found photographic documentation of the North Freeway, but they didn't have an aerial. They only had views from the ground. And so then I just started looking on the internet, just seeing like, you know, what I might find, and, you know, could there be some way that I could like make sort of a similar image for myself. And I found this this construction of the freeway through a black neighborhood in San Antonio, Texas in 1969. And so here we have a moment that's like these two, you know, places that are independent of each other. But the thing in common is that it's a black neighborhood, right? That the freeway is being built through the black neighborhood. And then being able to connect those two stories, thinking about this network, this larger network, because redlining wasn't unique to North Omaha. And so typically when you find a redline neighborhood, you also find a freeway that was built through it or built around it, as a way of keeping it disconnected. And so, you know, that opened me up to the possibility of beginning to just appropriate other imagery and fold it into the work. And so I wanted to have, you know, a photograph of Will Brown and Vivian Strong, but the only images existing being tied to newspaper clippings. And so, you know, I pulled this from like a, you know, microfiche scan, and you know, it's like a really small image on a really big newspaper. And so I was like kind of stuck with this resolution, but then also just thinking about the text, you know, the caption that he is kind of frozen in the status of being a victim of the mob mom's wrath. And I wanted to change that image. And so I, took this, I turned it into a digital negative, made a silver gelatin of that through like a contact sheet, contact silver gelatin through a sheet of dirty glass, scan that silver gelatin back to a digital file, and then further manipulated it and came away with this. Something that, sort of, I guess I felt honored him in a way, but maybe that had like some warmth or emotional resonance. And then even, just doing things as simply as, like the Anna Martine Whitehead, where I'm just intervening on an image by cropping or moving information. And, but like that technique isn't unique to like me or her as an artist. And it actually goes back to anti-lynching organizations when these photographs were quite popular, because the act of spectacle lynching was quite popular. That anti-lynching organizations would often republish the photographs, but say, don't look at the victim, look at the crowd. And so I guess just pointing out that all of this information, the fact that all of these white men could openly commit murder, photograph themselves, and get away with it. Like, I think 3 people were tried, but all of them were acquitted. That truly defines America. And that information exists in that same photograph, in the full photograph, right? But it calls for us paying attention to those things to be able to wake up to those truths. And so it's with that fuller understanding that I began, or that I was like, kind of approaching things that I was seeing, and then deciding to try to photograph them to say something more. And then, kind of past the singular image, considering ways of building out or using context to really build out our sort of experience of nuance. How sometimes when we see things and they become familiar, and maybe the more we familiarize ourselves with that level of sight, we can, I guess, more deeply understand like these political moments. But that fundamentally, like, photography holds an immense amount of value, and that currency being that they can shape belief. And which brings me back to the start. And so this was my first time deciding to watch a video like this, and I thought a lot about the fear I felt. And then I thought about my mom and the way that she taught me fear as an act of love, because it's important for me to understand how danger exists and like what that feeling of fear means. And so, like, I guess, like, thinking about that act of love, that's like where the portraits in this work come in. And it's the last part of the project that I worked on. And I was always reluctant to include pictures of people, because again, this wasn't my community. It wasn't, where I grew up. I'm not from there. And I had to like better understand my own intentions before just deciding, to make images of people who live there or who are from there. And my friend Lisa wrote an essay for this work, and I'm just going to read. I'll close out today by reading a little bit of that. She says, "At moments, I tell you, these photographs crush me. the golden hush settling across the street, how when she turns her face to the light, she glows. Your sampling of history and the way the silence speaks between. I want to call what I see beauty, but what I think I mean is love. Because it is a kind of love when a people who know observation can imperil say, I will let you look at me. And when you stand behind the camera and say, I see you. A love and seen in someone else's eyes that red lines were one of the many lies told to fix the image. And that Black people have always written around them and through them and all over the top. In the beginning, you and I were born into this place. Ours is a country that would force you to see your outlines in the body of a boy shot to death on Chicago's Southwest Side, and absolve me from recognizing mine in the lyncher's smile. That blindness means that I struggle to find language to tell the story while you speak it in registers. I won't lie to you. There's a part of me when I look at the woman with dark skin and pink lips and arms thick like mine that wants to ask her for forgiveness she does not owe me. Give me a chorus to repeat so I don't have to articulate my own reckoning. She looks back at me, but remains silent. In the end, the defense tried its best to use the mother's words against her son. She refused to speak. When I go looking, the photograph I find is of the boy smiling shy beneath a red mortar board, a long hand not yet grown into holding a rolled diploma. I envision the family, wrung out from knowing that too many strangers watch their boy take his last breath, sifting through the snapshots to find the one that delivers his memory. Behold, this you can have of him. The rest we will keep. And I always like to thank or to dedicate this talk to Will, Vivian, Laquan, and North Omaha. And so yeah, after I graduated, I spent the year kind of scheming this up as a book and was able to find a publisher who helped make that a reality. And so unfortunately, it's since been sold out. It was a very limited run, 165 copies, but that's because each book was handmade. Yeah, that's it for the lecture. So I'll stop there and I can take some questions.
Thanks so much, Zora. And to everybody out there, if you want to put questions in the Q&A, I will relate them. So go ahead with that if you've got them. Maybe I can ask a question while everybody formulates theirs. Maybe I'll start with a broad one to give them a little bit of time. As a photographic artist myself, I'm always interested in hearing about why people choose to continue to work with photography. A lot of people can talk pretty easily about what got us into it, but it gets more complicated the more you use it. And you've addressed this a lot, but I wonder if you could just expand on it a little bit. I was taken by when you said, photography has this currency to shape belief, and you've talked about disciplinary processes a lot too, which makes me think of John Tagg's disciplinary frame, which I don't know if everybody's familiar with that, but how you see photography working as a disciplinary agent and its opposite. Are you using photography as an undisciplinary agent, if that's a thing to say? Is there is there some sort of way that you're turning the channels of discipline against themselves by being a photographic artist?
Yeah, I mean, I feel photography is really important to me, and it always has been. We know when I would spend weekends at my grandparents' house, I would always be looking at the same photo albums over and over and over again. They also had, they kept like all of the copies of Jet and Ebony magazine, and I would always be looking at those, not to like read anything, but just to look at pictures. You know, my mom, you know, was always like, always had a disposable camera, and actually got into the practice of like always buying one for me too, when she would get one for herself for the weekends, because I would just bug her, you know, incessantly if she didn't. And then at one point, like we had like a camcorder, and I like, you know, it would typically come out, you know, at like parties and things. And I would always like just be like so excited for the moment that the adults got bored with it and would finally just hand it to one of the kids, and then we got to be in charge of like what was being imaged, right? And so I think that, like, you know, photography is really important to me in that specific way. But and then and that, like, you know, I love learning and talking about, you know, all aspects like photography, you know, the object, you know, the making, you know, all of it. You know, I love to talk about photography. But I would say it's like I don't let the medium define me as an artist. Rather, I'm just, you know, an artist who, you know, primarily works in photography, but maybe more broadly, I'm interested in images. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so it turns into something that's like working with, around, and through the photograph. I think that image you have of Will Brown, like, really is a very interesting process to think about, like that the newspaper image serves that first purpose, and then, you know, it's something powerful to you to look at, but before it becomes something that you're representing to us, like all those steps it had to go through to be processed. And even though it starts from that same base image, like it comes out as something super different. Yeah, which I don't know, I find that's really, it's an
Yeah,
interesting way to process thinking about an image like that through physical process.
yeah. Well, it was almost like, maybe in a way I was trying to visualize context, right? And that was like what I was always sort of up against, was that, like, you know, whenever I would show something, I would then have to like deeply contextualize it for people to be like, oh, okay, like I got it, right? And but like I think that that moment of deciding like I was gonna just do this thing and see what happened, it was a way of like, yeah, like working with this idea of context and as a visual means. I see we got a couple of questions, so we can
We do, yeah. I'll read them out
probably,
loud
yeah, yeah.
just to make it seem a little bit more like we're in a room. Kelsey Forkner, one of our MFAs in photography, what tips would you give about making social justice printed work, I'm going to guess is what that says, that is impactful for an audience who isn't immediately affected by the issue?
I mean, I think that like we talk a lot about like audience, especially, you know, in you know, like in like academic settings, like when we're talking about art. And I feel like sort of what I've learned, you know, like the past, doing this for the past decade, is that I'm not necessarily concerned, you know, like with it being impactful with a particular type of people, right? Um, the only audience I'm really concerned with is the audience of me. And while that might sound like a selfish thing to say, it's because I know that as soon as I put my work out there, as soon as I put myself out there, you know, much like the experience of being racialized, it becomes organized and categorized in ways that like that I don't necessarily like see or like talk about or you know, prescribe to, you know, like you know, as soon as I put corrections out into the world, people started calling me a prison photographer. I didn't set out to make, I didn't have a desire to like go and like photograph like in a prison. Like I never set out to do that. I was just like, this is my life right now. I don't have enough time. I don't have the luxury and privilege of time, right? I have to work. I have to go to school so I can stop doing this work. Um, And so the only thing that I knew to do in that moment was like, I'm just going to photograph what I'm doing every day, because it takes the time out of the equation for me, right? And so yeah, but I mean, I think that's like, like how I answer that question is like, it's never really about like, it's never about an audience. I just feel like, I'll put things out into the world because that's what I do, and I just want to be able to talk about those things. And further, I don't know, like my work has existed in a lot of different ways. It's published in like, art books, it's available online, but it's also been used, like some of the images from corrections were commissioned for an organization that studied juvenile criminal justice practices, and they wanted some like an artwork aspect as a part of their publication. So it's been there. I've participated in a symposium that was like talking about arts and incarceration, specifically through like a writing program that was that did publications with individuals who were incarcerated. And so like, to me, the work, yeah, like once the work is out into the world, it's gonna it'll just be impactful. I feel it'll be impactful if you know its purpose, and the right places to put it out. Sorry, I feel like that was like a rambling sort of answer, but it's a good question.
We'll take one more from Kelsey since it was up there. What takeaways did you hope your audience would walk away from your correction series with? Perhaps you've already answered that, but.
I mean, I don't think I had like any hope of like people walking away with anything in particular, but I feel like I've seen people engage with corrections in a lot of different ways. Like some people like were very clearly made uncomfortable and wouldn't engage with it for very long. Or sometimes people like who have had a similar experience, like they will come up to me and like talk with me about it, and like they find some sort of meaning in it because they relate to it in that way. Or somebody who was like, I didn't even know that we incarcerated kids, like I didn't know that this was an actual thing. And so like yeah, I guess I feel like I'm a believer in relational aesthetics, that like I as artist am merely a conduit to facilitate social interaction. And I guess like that's like the best way that I can answer that question, is that like the work is going to do a lot of different things for different people, but it's mainly based on like a viewer's lived experience and like what they are bringing to like what the audience member brings to it from their own standpoint and experience. Yeah.
Thank you. The next one from Marissa Walker. Professor Murff, that was very moving, important presentation. Thank you for sharing your professional journey. Photography is a great way to bring social issues to the forefront. What series are you working on now?
Yeah, I've been since like, I guess like mid-December, I've been working on a new book with Aperture. So that'll be coming out in the fall. I can't really talk about it because I signed a contract that said I can't say anything yet, but that's what I've been working on right now is, but mainly it's been like pouring through the last 10 years of making work, sprinkling some new things in there. But yeah, that's what I'm up to right now. So keep your eyes open this fall.
Thanks to non-disclosure agreements for that, but something for all of us to look forward to. The next question is actually really great. How does a student find out where and how to put out photography work that deals with social justice issues? Do you have any like outlets that you yourself go looking for to like discover new works and things like that?
Let's see. Well, I mean, like I barely have time to look at work anymore. Like sadly to say. But yeah, I mean, like I think those like spaces, like like there are like online platforms and things like that that deal directly like with social justice. But I mean, to me, I don't know, I would just say like I don't know, where do you want to see your work? And even if that isn't a space like where they typically publish like work that's like oriented towards social justice, it doesn't mean that it can't exist in that space. You know, I would say just like, I would, you know, just encourage you to like, to think past those boundaries. But I don't know, I guess like Pete Brook, he used to run a blog, Prison Photography. I don't know if he's still on that anymore. Yeah, I don't know. There's, yeah, I can't think of like a lot of things right at this moment, but those spaces exist out there. They're around. You just have to look a little harder because they don't exist. They're, you know, kind of few and far between. But if I think of some things, I'll send Aaron an email. Maybe he can forward on the information.
I can certainly forward information on to everyone else after this session. Well,
yeah,
we're a few minutes even over time now. So if anybody wants to squeeze one last quick question into the chat, I will accept it if it comes in the next couple of seconds here. But if not, let's just all thank Zora for joining us. Thank you so much. That was an excellent talk.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll clap by myself and represent.
Yeah, all right. yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Zora. We'll talk soon. All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye.